My name is Nadia Calloway. I am 31 years old. And the night of my cousin Priya's engagement dinner was when I finally understood that some people do not want the truth. They want the version of you that makes them comfortable. The dinner was held in the Harrington Room, a private dining space on the second floor of the Aldwell Hotel, the kind of place that sets out cloth napkins and charges $18 for a side of roasted potatoes. My Aunt Delia had reserved it 3 months in advance. There were 41 people at 5 round tables, and by the time the appetizers arrived, my sister Anata had already started. She stood up between the soup and the salad course, which I would later think was a strange choice, practically speaking, and she said, in a voice she had clearly been rehearsing, "I think we should address something as a family, since we're all here." I set down my fork. Nadia has been telling people she is seriously ill. For 3 years, she's been using that story to get out of responsibilities, to get attention from this family, and to avoid being held accountable for anything. There is nothing wrong with her. I have watched her. I have watched the way she performs it when it's useful and drops it when it isn't. She is not sick. She is manipulative, and I am tired of pretending otherwise in front of people I love. My father, at the table to my left, gave a single slow nod, the kind that means he had heard this before and agreed with it. My mother reached for her wine glass. My cousin Priya, whose engagement dinner this was supposed to be, looked down at her bread plate. I did not push back my chair. I did not raise my voice. I picked up my water glass, took one sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been. Renata was still standing. She looked at me, waiting. I said, "Okay." That was all. She sat down. The table went back to the bread. And I spent the next 4 hours at that dinner understanding something I had been slow to accept, that there is a category of cruelty that does not require the other person to be a monster. Renata was not a monster. She was a woman who had spent 34 years being the one the family organized itself around, and somewhere in those years she had decided that my illness was a challenge to her position rather than a fact about my body. That is not a defense of what she did. It is the structural reason for it, and without that reason the story doesn't make sense. I should go back, because 41 people at a dinner table is not the beginning of anything. I grew up in a house in Claremont, a mid-sized city about 90 minutes north of the coast, in a family that ran on a clear internal logic. My father, Graham Calloway, was a civil engineer who dealt in certainties, load-bearing walls, drainage gradients, permit approvals. My mother, Susan, taught elementary school for 22 years and then stopped when her knees made standing all day impractical. They were not unkind people. They were people with a strong preference for things that could be measured and confirmed, and they had organized their parenting around that preference. Renata was 3 years older than me and had always fit that frame well. She was the kind of child who came home with documentation of her achievements, trophies, certificates, report cards she placed on the kitchen counter, without being asked. She went to a state university on a partial merit scholarship, graduated in 4 years, married a man named Doug who sold commercial insurance, and by the time she was 28 had a house 12 minutes from my parents and a daughter named Cora, who they babysat on Thursdays. She was not the golden child in any dramatic sense. She was simply the one who had handed my parents the version of a life they understood, and they had accepted it with the relief of people who had been hoping for exactly that. I had not handed them that version. I had gone to a different school, changed my major twice, taken a job in medical records administration that they found neither impressive nor entirely comprehensible, and rented an apartment in a building that my father once described as functional. I did not do any of this to be difficult. I did it because it was the shape my life had taken, and for a long time I thought the shape was fine. Then I was 28, and I started losing weight without trying to. My joints ached in the mornings in a way that felt different from the ordinary stiffness of someone who sits at a desk for 8 hours. I was tired in a way that sleep did not fix, the kind of tired that lives behind your eyes and is still there when you wake up. I went to my primary care physician, Dr. Sandra Okafor, who ran a panel and referred me to a rheumatologist named Dr. Margaret Chen. Dr. Chen was 61 years old, precise in the way of someone who had been doing the same careful work for a long time, and she did not say anything to me that she had not confirmed. After 4 months of appointments and a specific pattern of blood work and imaging, she gave me a diagnosis of an autoimmune condition, one of the connective tissue variants that does not have a clean name most people recognize, which I would later understand was part of the problem. It was not cancer. It was not something that showed up visibly on my body most of the time. It was a condition that required management, that waxed and waned, that made some weeks genuinely difficult and other weeks nearly invisible in its effects. I told my parents. My mother asked if it was serious. I said it was chronic and managed. My father asked if I would still be able to work. I said yes. That was more or less the end of the conversation. I did not tell Renata directly because by that point we were not in the habit of telling each other things directly, and I assumed she would hear it from my mother, which she did. What I did not anticipate was the interpretation Renata would build around what she heard. I did not find out about that interpretation for almost a year. I found out at a family barbecue at my parents' house, when I declined to help carry the folding tables from the garage because my hands were having a bad week and gripping anything large was genuinely uncomfortable. Renata said, in a voice low enough that I almost missed it, "You know you can drop the act when it's just us." I looked at her. "Mom's not watching," she said. "You don't have to perform." I did not answer that. I went inside and helped my mother put the condiments on a tray, which I could do with one hand, and I spent the rest of that afternoon deciding that Renata had said something she did not mean and we would both forget it. We did not forget it. Over the following 2 years, the interpretation calcified into something structural. Renata began referring to my condition in air quotes when she thought I couldn't hear, Nadia's illness, with a slight pause before and after. She told our cousin Marcus, who told me later, that she believed I had convinced myself I was sick because I needed an excuse for not doing more with my life. She told my mother, who mentioned it to me in the distressed way my mother had of mentioning things she wanted me to address without her involvement, that she thought I was leaning on the diagnosis. What Renata did not know, because she had never once asked, was what the diagnosis actually looked like in practice. She did not know that I had a medication schedule that required a reminder alarm at 7 in the morning and another at 9 at night, and that missing doses had consequences I spent 3 days recovering from. She did not know that Dr. Chun had added a second specialist, a gastroenterologist named Dr. Philip Reyes at the Aldwell Medical Center, because the condition had extended into a secondary involvement that required its own monitoring. She did not know that in the 18 months between my initial diagnosis and the night of Priya's engagement dinner, I had attended 26 medical appointments, had 2 procedures, filled 41 prescriptions, and maintained a paper file in a drawer in my apartment that was 4 inches thick. She did not know any of that because I had not told her, because I had made a private decision early on that I was not going to perform my illness for anyone's verification. I went to my appointments. I managed my medications. I did my job. I was a senior records coordinator at Aldwell Regional now, which meant I spent my days organizing exactly the kind of documentation that described exactly the kind of condition I had, which was its own quiet irony. And I kept my file. The file was not a dramatic object. It was a manila folder, reinforced with a binder clip, sitting in the second drawer of my kitchen desk between a folder of lease documents and a folder of tax returns. It contained, in chronological order, the original referral letter from Dr. Okafor, the initial assessment from Dr. Chen, every lab result from the past 3 years with Dr. Chen's annotations in the margins, the imaging reports, the 2 procedure summaries from Dr. Reyes, the current medication list with dosages and the dates each prescription had been filled, and, added 4 days before Priya's engagement dinner, a 2-page clinical summary that Dr. Chen had prepared at the request of my attorney. The attorney was named Patricia Wells. I had retained her 6 weeks earlier, not for any dramatic reason, but because I worked in medical records and I understood that documentation had a life of its own, and because a colleague of mine named James Oduya, who had spent 4 years dealing with a family dispute over his mother's estate and had wished, repeatedly, that he had started building a paper trail earlier, had told me once that the best time to establish a record is before you need one. I had not known when I called Patricia Wells that I would need one in 6 weeks at a hotel dining room with 41 people and cloth napkins. I had simply understood that the pattern of what Renata was doing had a direction to it, and that direction was not stopping on its own. The months between the barbecue where Renata told me to drop the act and the night of Priya's engagement dinner had a rhythm to them that I can describe precisely because I was paying attention. In October, Renata told my parents that she thought they should stop accommodating what she called my limitations at family events because doing so was reinforcing behavior that was not medically necessary. My mother, who did not want a conflict, responded by quietly stopping the things she had been doing, no longer saving me the chair closest to the door, no longer adjusting the timing of family dinners so they didn't run past 9, which was when my evening medication made me meaningfully tired. I noticed. I adjusted. I said nothing. In December, Renata told Doug, who told my cousin Priya's fiancé Kiran at a Christmas gathering, that she was genuinely worried about me but not in the way I claimed to be worried about myself, meaning she thought the problem was psychological rather than physical and that I had found a useful structure to avoid responsibility. Priya told me this in January in a text message she prefaced with, "I didn't know if I should tell you this, but..." I thanked her. I wrote it down in a small notebook I kept in my bag. In February, my father mentioned, during a phone call about my grandmother's upcoming 82nd birthday, that Renata had suggested I might want to talk to someone about the anxiety she believed was driving my self-diagnosis. My father said this carefully, in the tone of a man relaying a message he had been asked to deliver and was not entirely comfortable with. I said that I had a care team I was satisfied with, and that I appreciated the concern. He said, of course, and we moved on to my grandmother's cake preference. Each of these things was, individually, manageable. Together they formed a pattern I recognized from my work and records, a narrative being built, one document at a time, that would eventually become very difficult to argue with if it went unanswered long enough. I called Patricia Wells on a Thursday in early March. I told her what I had told Dr. Chun at our previous appointment, that I believed a family member was constructing a case that I was fabricating my illness, that the case was being built through conversations and third-party communications, and that I wanted to establish an official record of my diagnosis and treatment history before the situation escalated further. Patricia listened without interrupting. She asked 4 questions. She said she would contact Dr. Chen's office that week. Dr. Chen agreed to prepare a clinical summary. She did not find this an unusual request. She told me, at the appointment where we discussed it, that she had prepared similar summaries more times than I would expect, and that in her experience the people who asked for them were usually the people who had been right to ask. She wrote 2 pages. She noted the diagnosis, the duration of treatment, the current medication protocol, the involvement of Dr. Reyes, and the clinical assessment that the condition was genuine, chronic, and appropriately documented. She signed it. Patricia filed it. 4 days later was Priya's engagement dinner. I want to be precise about the sequence of events after Renata sat down because the sequence matters. I spent the remainder of the dinner at my assigned seat. I ate the roasted chicken. I made conversation with my Aunt Delia on my right about her recent kitchen renovation, which involved a dispute with a tile contractor that had been resolved only partially to her satisfaction. I did not bring up what Renata had said. I did not seek out expressions of sympathy or ask anyone at the table what they thought. The 41 people at the Harrington room had just watched my sister tell them I was a liar, and I had said, okay, and now we were all eating chicken together, which is a sentence that still strikes me as both absurd and accurate. What I did do, once, was look across the room. There were 5 tables. I was at table 2. At table 4, which was the one closest to the window that overlooked the hotel's side garden, sat my Aunt Delia's +1 for the evening, a woman named Dr. Vivian Marsh, who was 63 years old, who had been Delia's neighbor and close friend for 11 years, and who had been a practicing physician in internal medicine for 35 of those years before retiring the previous spring. Dr. Marsh had not said anything during Renata's announcement. She had set down her fork, which I noticed, and she had listened, and then she had picked her fork back up. She caught my eye once, briefly, across the room. She did not make a face. She simply held the look for one moment, and then returned to her conversation. I had not invited Dr. Marsh to the dinner. I had not known she would be there until I arrived. I had not coordinated anything with her because there was nothing to coordinate. She was there because Delia had invited her, and I was there because Priya was my cousin, and the only connection between those 2 facts was that we were both in the same room when Renata made her announcement. The significance of that was not something I arranged. It was something that happened. The reveal came in the way that most significant things do, not dramatically, but logistically. Priya's engagement dinner ended at approximately 10 o'clock. The tables had been cleared, the cake had been served, and people were beginning the slow process of gathering coats and exchanging embraces. I had retrieved my jacket from the coat check near the stairs and was standing near the door when Dr. Marsh appeared at my left shoulder. She said, "I want you to know that what was said at dinner was not something I am going to let stand without comment." I looked at her. "I am retired," she said, "but I still hold my license, and I still know how to read a clinical chart. I also still know Patricia Wells. As it happens, we were on the hospital ethics board together for 6 years." She paused. "She told me last week that she had filed a clinical summary on behalf of a records coordinator at Aldwell Regional who is dealing with a family credibility dispute. She did not tell me your name. I did not know it was you until tonight." I did not say anything immediately. "I am going to write a letter," Dr. Marsh said. "A professional letter on my letterhead, addressed to Patricia's file, noting that I was present this evening and that the characterization offered by your sister was inconsistent with the presentation of a person managing a documented autoimmune condition." She looked at me steadily. "You do not have to ask me to do this. I am telling you I am going to do it because I believe you should know." My right hand, which had been holding my jacket, went still. I said, "Thank you." She said, "You have nothing to thank me for. I am doing what the situation requires." And then she put on her coat and went to find Delia, and I stood near the door for another moment before I walked out into the November air and sat in my car in the hotel parking lot for 6 minutes, looking at the dashboard before I started the engine and drove home. That was how it happened. No confrontation. No speech. No moment where I turned to Renata in the middle of the room and handed her the folder. The reveal was not a scene I designed. It was a record that had been building for 3 years, documented by physicians and filed by an attorney and witnessed, by coincidence and professional obligation, by a 63-year-old retired internist who had spent her career knowing exactly what she was looking at. I had not thrown a single thing. The room had simply become a place where the truth was already present, and there was nowhere else for the evening to go. The consequences were not immediate. They were the kind that arrive in stages, which is in my experience the only kind worth paying attention to. The first stage was a phone call from Patricia Wells 12 days after the dinner. She had received Dr. Marsh's letter, 2 pages, formal letterhead, clinical language, and had added it to my file. She had also, at Dr. Marsh's suggestion, reached out to my father directly, not as a threat but as a professional courtesy, to inform him that his daughter had a documented medical record that had now been witnessed by a licensed physician and was on file with an attorney. Patricia described my father's response as a long pause followed by several clarifying questions. The second stage was a conversation my mother initiated with me 3 weeks after the dinner at a coffee shop on Meridian Street that she had chosen because it was not anywhere either of us usually went. She arrived before me and was already seated when I got there, with her hands folded on the table in the particular configuration that meant she had prepared what she wanted to say. She told me that she had spoken with Dr. Chen's office directly. She had called them, she said, because she wanted to hear it from someone with credentials, which I understood to mean she had not fully trusted the letter but had needed a second confirmation, and that the woman she spoke with had confirmed, without disclosing details, that I was an active patient with an ongoing treatment plan. My mother said, "I didn't handle this well." I said, "No." She said, "I was taking the easier position." I said, "I know." She put both hands flat on the table, a gesture I recognized as her version of accepting something, and we sat there for a moment. She ordered a chamomile tea. I ordered a coffee. We talked about my grandmother's birthday for 20 minutes, and then we left. It was not a resolution in any movie sense. It was a beginning, which is a different thing and slower and, in my experience, more real. The third stage involved Renata, and it did not involve me directly, which I have come to understand was exactly correct. What Renata received was not a confrontation from me. She received, over a period of 6 weeks, the accumulated weight of her own record. Patricia sent a formal letter to Renata, not threatening legal action, because there was no legal action to take, but documenting the sequence of events, the clinical file, the witness letter, and the fact that the characterization Renata had offered at the engagement dinner was now part of a documented record that would follow any subsequent attempts to repeat it. Doug, who was a commercial insurance professional and who therefore understood the significance of documented records better than most people, read the letter before Renata did and reportedly sat with it for a long time before handing it to her. My cousin Marcus, who told me most of this in pieces over the following months, said that Renata had gone very quiet after the letter arrived. Not remorseful in any articulate way, more the quiet of someone recalibrating a structure they had relied on and finding that it was no longer what they had thought it was. She did not contact me for 11 weeks. When she did, it was a text message. It said, "I think I got some things wrong. I don't know how to talk about this yet." I read it twice. I did not respond immediately. I waited 2 days and then I wrote back, "I know. When you're ready. I do not know if we will find our way to a functional relationship. I think that is probably a question for a different year. What I know is that the conversation, when it eventually happens, will start from an accurate foundation, which is the only kind of conversation worth having." The fourth stage was smaller, and in some ways the one I think about most. It was a Tuesday morning in January, about 2 months after the dinner. I was at work, my desk at Aldwell Regional, the third one from the window in the records coordination office, between James O'Dea and a woman named Carla Brandt who brought homemade granola on Fridays. I was reviewing an incoming file, the standard task, and the file contained a clinical summary that had been prepared by a physician for a patient dealing with a credibility dispute in a legal context. It was not my file. It was someone else's. But the format was identical to what Dr. Chun had prepared for me, the structure, the language, the signature at the bottom. I had processed hundreds of these documents over for years and had never thought about them as anything other than administrative work. That morning I held the file for a moment longer than I needed to, and I understood something I had been close to understanding for a while, that the work I did every day was the infrastructure behind exactly these moments. The moments where a record is the only thing standing between someone's truth and someone else's version of it. I put the file in its folder. I filed it correctly. I went back to work. 18 months after Priya's engagement dinner, the shape of my life had changed in ways that were mostly quiet. I was still at Aldwell Regional, now as a records compliance lead, a title that came with a modest increase in salary and a responsibility set that suited my specific abilities well. Dr. Chun had adjusted my medication protocol twice in that period, once in a direction that made things harder for about 6 weeks and then easier in a sustained way, and once in a direction that simply made things steadier. Dr. Reyes had cleared the secondary involvement as stable, which meant less frequent monitoring, which meant one fewer appointment every 8 weeks, which felt like a gift. My parents and I were in a different configuration than before, not repaired exactly, but honest in a way we had not been before the dinner. My father had asked me at one point to explain my condition to him in terms he could hold on to, and I had done that. I had taken a single sheet of paper and written down the name, the basic mechanism, the management approach, and the realistic expectations for the next several years. He had folded it and put it in his wallet. He had not said anything dramatic about it. That was fine.
The fold was enough.
Renata and I had 2 real conversations by then, both on the phone, both careful and incomplete, and still in progress. Doug had sent me a brief text after the second one that said only, "Thank you for being patient with this." I did not know exactly what to do with that, so I said of course and meant it, which is the best outcome for that kind of text. Priya and Kiran had set their wedding for the following spring. I had been asked to be involved in the planning, which I was in the limited way that suited my energy and my schedule. Priya had never said anything directly about what happened at her engagement dinner.
She didn't need to.
She had sent me the letter from Dr. Marsh, which she had photographed at my request for my own file, and that was more than words. The folder in my kitchen drawer was thicker now. Not dramatically. A few additional pages, an updated lab panel, a renewal form. It was still a folder. It still sat between the lease documents and the tax returns. I did not keep it there as a weapon. I kept it there because it was accurate, and accuracy is its own form of protection, and I had learned that early enough to be grateful for it. There is a thing I have come to understand about the kind of cruelty that operates through disbelief. It is not always loud. It does not require malice in the dictionary sense. It requires only a sustained preference for a version of you that is more convenient than the real one, and a willingness to repeat that version until it becomes the one other people hold. The answer to that kind of cruelty is not a confrontation. It is a record. Not because the record wins an argument. It does not, usually, not in the way arguments are won in rooms. But because a record means the truth has a location. It exists somewhere other than inside you. It has a timestamp and a signature, and a place in a file that another person has organized and can produce. And a truth with a location is much harder to argue with than a truth that lives only in the body of the person whose truth it is. I did not plan what happened at the Harrington room. I did not know Dr. Marsh would be there. I did not arrange the coincidence that placed a retired internist with 35 years of clinical experience at table 4 when my sister stood up between the soup and the salad course and told 40 people I was a liar. What I had done was build a record before I needed it. Everything else followed from that. The peace I have now is not loud. It is the peace of a person who did the work accurately and then let the work do what work does when it is accurate. That is enough. That has always been enough. If you could go back to a single moment in this story, the dinner, the parking lot, the text from Renata, or the morning I held that stranger's file at my desk, which one do you think changed the direction of everything? Leave it in the comments. I read them. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new story every week, same time, same place. And if you know someone who has been on the receiving end of a family's preferred version of who they are, share this with them. Sometimes it helps to hear that the record exists and that it matters. Take care of yourselves.
I'll see you next week.